Today's daf is Masechta Menachos Daf Vav, and we'll begin from the Mishnah on Daf Vav Amar Aleph, right by the Mishnah over here. So the Mishnah begins. Nitmu'u. Mishnah begins. Nitmu'u sha'areha. Nitmu'u sha'areha. Nisrufu sha'areha avdu sha'areha. In the carbon mincha, you have shirayim. After you take the kmitza, you have shirayim. And you're supposed to be makar of the kmitza on the mizbeach, right? After putting it in a kli shares, put it on the salt it, and then you makter it. You see how the kohen is makter it with the vessel. We'll talk about that later today. But what happens after you took the kmitza? The Mishnah says the leftovers got tame, got burnt, or it got lost. So then the Mishnah says, Kimidas Rabbi Elazar. According to the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, we're going to line with the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, who says that by a regular carbon, if the blood, if the meat got tame, you could still be makriv, you could still spray the blood on the mizbeach. So he will say same thing over here. Despite the fact that the shiurah, the leftovers got tame or lost or burnt, you could still be makriv the kaimets on the mizbeach. Uchmidas Rabbi Yeshua, but according to Rabbi Yeshua, Pesula, according to Rabbi Yeshua, who says that if you don't have meat, you can't spray the blood. So if the meat became tame, the blood is not sprayed on the mizbeach. So according to Rabbi Yeshua, you will not put the kaimets on the mizbeach. Ama Rav. And that basically would mean that the owner of the mincha would have to bring another one. Ama Rav. Rav said that Rabbi Yeshua says it's possible is v'hush nitmu kol sharev. All the leftovers became tame, so you have really no leftovers. But if you have only partial of the leftovers became tame, but you still have some left, then Rabbi Shua will agree to Rabbi Elazar that it's kosher. Because Gemara understood that Rabbi Rav was pretty specific in his words. Nitma, only if it was tame, then you have the distinction between partly becoming tame and all of it becoming tame. Ovid v'saref, but if it was lost or burnt, no matter what, even a little bit was lost, a little bit was burnt, the whole carbon mincha is invalid according to Rabbi Yeshua. So the Gemara says, "My kasava, how could you? What does Rabbi Yeshua hold, and why would Rav explain Rabbi Yeshua this way?" To make a differentiation between if the leftovers were burnt or the leftovers became tame. If Rabbi Yeshua held shiura milsehi, that when something is left over, that's still something left and it's worth something. So then nafila aviv v'saraf nami. Then why wouldn't Rabbi Yeshua say it's a kosher carbon mincha, that if you have only partial of it was lost, partial of it was burnt, and you have some left, the carbon mincha should be kosher. If Rav, according to Rabbi Yeshua, would require that the entire leftovers remain intact, so then why by Tame you don't need the entire shiurayim intact? V'nitma my tama, the maratza tzutz, because the tzitz will effectuate an acceptance that despite the fact that some of it is tame, despite the fact that some of it became tame, the tzitz says that this carbon mincha is tame, is still valid. So if the tzitz does a job like that, we call shirah nami. So what's the difference if why don't you say that even if the entire leftovers became tame, the tzitz would say it's a good carbon mincha? Answers the Gemara, la'olam kesava, really Rabbi Yeshua holds shirah milsihi. The leftovers is something. V'nitma really, you need to have something left over, and then Rabbi Yeshua will say it's kosher, and whether some of it became tame, and the same idea would hold true if some of it became lost, some of it became burnt. If you have something left over, even Rabbi Yeshua would agree to Rabbi Eliezer that it is still a valid carbon mincha. You could do the kmitza. The fact that Rav said nitma kol sha'areh means because he's going back on the Mishnah. The first example that the Mishnah gives is nitmu. But Rav could say his words by nifsafu or avdu. And the point being is that as long as you have something left over of the mincha, even Rabbi Shua would agree that it's still, you could be makar of the kaimets. Kedetani Rabbi Shua, like Tanya, Rabbi Shua, we have a brisa that says that clearly. If you have any carbon in the Torah, that everything became tamei, but you have just a kazayas meat that did not become tamei, or a kazayas chelev, a kazayas of the fats that's supposed to be put on the mizbeach. So then zorek asadam, you could sprinkle the blood. If you only have a half a zayas of basa and a half a zayas of chelev, they don't combine to become one zayas, because the basa was supposed to be eaten and you don't have a zayas left, and the chelev is supposed to be on the mizbeach and you don't have a zayas for that on the mizbeach. So you really have nothing left over. So you're sprinkling blood on nothing, on a carbon that's not here. But if an oila, even if you have left that did not become tamei, a half a zayis of basan, half a zayis of chelev. Well, carbon oil is different than any other carbon because the entire meat and chelev are put on the mizbeach. So then you could combine the half a zayis of meat and the half a zayis of the fats, and still sprinkle the blood because the oil is totally burnt on the mizbeach. Comes along the brisa, and Rabbi Yeshua says, "Mincha afila kayam kayamis lo yizrek." If you have a carbon mincha and everything remains, don't sprinkle the blood. So this was a strange way of saying things. What do you mean? There's no blood by a mincha. Mincha is just a flower offering. Mincha maya vidite. What? How do you explain those last words? Omar Papa says minchas nesachim. Really, it's talking about a carbon. It's the minchas nesachim, which is brought when you bring any carbon, you bring flour offering onto the mizbeach with no kamitza, you just throw the whole thing on the mizbeach, so that if the whole carbon became tummy and all the chelev became tummy, and all you have left is minchas nesachim, so that's not enough. You wouldn't sprinkle the blood. Because I would have thought, since it's like part of the carbon, so it's as if you have something left over. It's like you have something left over the carbon. That not so. So the carbon would be invalid. Says the Gemara, how do you know that you need a kazayas left over? The pasuk says, that means makter the chelev, and that's fine enough. If you could be makter some fats on the mizbeach, even if the whole meat became tamei, the pasuk says that will be a valid carbon. I only see if you makra of fats on the mizbeach. Yoseres or shtei kloyes menalon. How do you know if you have all you have left is two little kidneys and a diaphragm, which is also supposed to be brought on the mizbeach? Probably it's not fats. The ketani, because the brisa says the ketani, because it says mincha filakui kayemis lo yizrak. Mincha hu de lo yizrak or yoseres or shtei kloyes yizrak. So first of all, the brisa seems to imply that only if the mincha is left over and everything else of the carbon is tamei, you can't sprinkle the blood. But if you have two kidneys left over or the diaphragm, so then you could sprinkle the blood. So how do you know that's enough of a leftover? So Rabbi Yochanan Zeyama l'reach nichoyach kol she'atamal l'reach nichoyach. The Torah says l'reach nichoyach. That the Torah tells you that anything that's brought on the mizbeach, if you have something to give Hashem for a reach nechaya, for a good pleasant smell, that's enough, and you could validate the carbon. So the pasuk teaches you two ideas: that if you have the fats left over, if the only thing that is left over this carbon, that means everything became tamei or lost or burnt, whatever. So if you have just the fats left over, you can sprinkle the blood. If you have just the Yeseres HaKavod and the Shtei Kloyes left over, you could sprinkle the blood. And why does the Torah have to tell you by both cases? The Torah had to tell you that if you have the fats left over, you could sprinkle the blood. And if you have there's two kidneys left over, you could sprinkle the blood. Because of Chaylev, which just say fats, have min chayv ein, says Shtei Kloyes loy. So the Torah had to tell you Yeseres HaKavod, Shtei Kloyes, because if the Torah only told you fats, I would think Yeseres or Shtei Kloyes is not enough of a leftover. But if the Torah told you that Yeseres and Shtei HaKloyes are enough of a leftover from the carbon. So then why do you have to tell me chaylev? Hava mina, I would have thought afila mincha. I would think that even if you have the minchas nesachim left over, that's enough. So the Torah tells you chaylev. So that only something like chaylev, or something part of the animal. Bottom line is, Rabbi Yeshua says if the total carbon is burnt, the fats and the meat, or it became tamei, so then you can't sprinkle the blood. If you have the chaylev left over, if the basar is not left over, but you have the fats or the useris or shtei akloyes, that's enough to give you a license to sprinkle the blood. But if all you have left that's valid of this carbon, that everything else became tamei, if all you have left is the minchas nesachim, if the minchas nesachim was left over, you would not be allowed to sprinkle the blood. And same idea by the kamitza. If the kamitza, you took a kamitza and all the shirayim are tamei, Rabbi Shua says in the Mishnah, don't be makar of the kaimitz because it's invalid. But if you have a drop left over, a kazayas left over, then it's fine. Mishnah says shloi b'kisharis pasol. As you see in the picture over here, when he's makrav on the mizbeach, he's makrav the kaimitz in a klisharis right directly over the fire. Says the Mishnah, but if you didn't do it that way, pasol. Rab Shimon says it's kosher. So we'll see what that means. If you divided the kaimitz into two parts, it's kosher. Alma Rabbi Yehuda b'Rei Rechia. We'll have three explanations of what Rab Shimon meant. Pashtus means that you could use your hand. So my time with Rab Shimon. So then what's Rab Shimon's reasoning? Amakra, because the pasuk says about a mincha is kodesh kadoshim he chatas v'chasham. A kodesh that the mincha has some qualities like a chatas, and like some qualities like a chasham. But I've to be mincha chatas, b'chli I've to be small ko asham. So Rab Shimon's opinion is, according to first understanding, Rabbi Yehuda b'Rei Rechia's understanding of Rab Shimon, is Rab Shimon gives you a choice. If you're going to use a keli, like the picture over here, so then you could even use your left hand over here, because it's. But if the Torah tells you that it's like a chatas, if you took the kamitza in your right hand, you could be makruh of it. So you basically have a choice how to be makruh of the mincha. If you use your hand, you need to use if you're throwing it with your hand, you need to use your right hand, and if you're using a keli, you could use left or right, doesn't matter. That's the first understanding. Rabbi Yami says, according to Rabbi Yanai, you could use any hand you want, but the first step is you have to put the kamitza into a klisharis, like he did it right over here. You put it into a klisharis. That's the first step. Once after you put it into klisharis, you could take it out and be makruv with your left or right hand. It doesn't matter. So even if you makruv with your hand, you can still use the left hand. That's Rav Yanai's understanding of Rab Shimon. Rav Nachman Yitzchak says he has a third understanding of Rab Shimon. Hakol moedim b'koimich shetoin kiddush. Everybody agrees that no, Rabbi Yanai says that you don't even have to put it into a klisharis. Rabbi Yanai's opinion is, as soon as the kamitza was done from a klisharis, you see, the original kamitza is done from a klisharis, you don't have to put it into another klisharis. That's the opinion of Shimon. There's no second step over here. You put it in your hand, go directly in the mizbeach, and throw it on the mizbeach. But according to Rab Nachman's Bar Yitzchak's understanding is that no, you take it, you do the kamitza and put it in klisharis. But once you take it out of the klisharis, then you can put on the mizbeach with your left or right hand, but you still need to put the kamitza in the klisharis. Whereas Rab Yanai's understanding, Rab Shimon, is that as soon as you took the kamitza from a klisharis, that's enough. That's Rabbi Yanai says. You don't even have to touch it anymore. You could bring it up with a shovel, or you could put it into anywhere. Once you did the kamitza, just get it onto the mizbeach, no matter how you do it. You have to put it first into a klisharis. So Meisvei, Gemara is going to ask a kasha against Rabbi Yehuda b'Rei Rechia. The Brisa says, "Hekter chalav ve'erim ve'etzim shehelim bein biyah bein kli bein biyomin bein b'smoil kasherin hakoimitz v'aktoris v'halavoyna shehelim bein biyad bein b'kli bein biyomin bein b'smoil kasherin." Tiyufta, the Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Chia's understanding of Rabbi Shimon was simple, that if you're going to use a keli, then you can use your left and right hand. But if you're using your hand, then you must use your right hand. That was his understanding of Rabbi Shimon. But this brisa says that Rabbi Shimon's opinion is, this brisa will go according to Rabbi Shimon. And it says that the koimitz, that you can use your hand and you can use your right or left hand and it'll be kasha. But according to Rabbi Yehuda's understanding of Rabbi Shimon is that you can only use your right hand if you're using your hand. Tiyufta Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Yehuda says, let's start in Katana. You have to read the brisa a little bit wrong. Biyad, biyamin. If you can use your right hand, if you can use your hand, you have to use only your right hand. Bechli, if you can use your left, if you can use a keli, bein biyamin, bein bismal. The brisa, you have to like put a, I guess, here's the brisa. So according to Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Chia's reading, you need to use your right hand if you're using yad. But if you can use a kli, then you get the choice to use your right or left hand. So it's not a question of against Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Chia's understanding of Rabbi Shimon. Tashma, come in here. Kamatzai, mikli sharetz. He did the kamitza from a kli sharetz. B'kitchay shloi b'kli sharetz, v'hela v'ktira shloi b'kli sharetz, pasal. Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon, machshiyum b'matan keli. Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon, a mater with a matan keli. So the brisa says, if you did not do the second step, put it into a kli sharetz, it's pasal. Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon says you still need to put it into any keli. It doesn't have to be a kli sharetz. So this is a question against Rav Nachman Yitzchak. Rav Nachman Yitzchak says that even Rav Shimon holds that it has to be a kli sharetz, and here Rav Shimon says that if you did the kamitza, you could put it into, you could put it into any keli. So how does he explain that? Ema mimatan kliva elech. What Rav Shimon says, Rav Shimon Makshirin, is once you already put it into a kli sharetz, you can take it out of the kli sharetz and then put it into any vessel. It doesn't have to go directly from the kli sharetz directly onto the mizbeach. You can put it into any vessel. That's what Rav Shimon's going to learn. That's how he's going to interpret this brisa. Tashma, come in here. The kamitza needs a kli sharetz. So this is the simple way of doing the kamitza. Again, you do the kamitza from a kli sharetz, you put it into another kli sharetz, and then you go to the mizbeach and you put the whole kamitza onto the mizbeach from the kli sharetz. Rab Shimon says, here he says, as soon as you do the kamitza, with your hand, you could just throw it onto the mizbeach, and you don't have to put it into a kli sharetz. Again, a question against Rab Shimon, against Rabbi Nachman by Yitzchak's understanding. Rab Shimon, that even Rab Shimon would agree that you need that step of putting it into a kli sharetz. So, how do you? But this brisa clearly says, Rab Shimon says, as soon as you did the kamitza from a kli sharetz, you could be makdar on the mizbeach without using your kli sharetz. So the Gemara says, Ema, you have to read the brisa. Kivich gemotza v'kitchen kli sharetz male maktir v'dai. You have to read it differently. Rav Shimon says, since you did the kamitza and were makadosh kli sharetz, then you can take it out of the kli sharetz and put it within your hand. So basically, you read the brisa as after you put it into this pot over here, the kohen can take it out and use his hand to be maktir the kamitza. So the Gemara has a third question against Rav Nachman Yitzchak, because the Gemara is going to end up saying that Rav Nachman Yitzchak is incorrect, that even Rav Shimon is going to hold that you don't need to put it into kli sharetz, because here the brisa says, come in here, if you did the kamitza with your right hand and then directly put it into your left hand, you put it right back into your right hand. But while it would, let's say bismillah, while you took the kamitza, right? Let's say he did the kamitza in his. Let's say he did the kamitza in his right hand, then put it into his left hand. Before putting it back into his right hand, while it was in the left hand, the chishev, we go to Amud Beis, the chishev oleha bein bechutz l'koyme bein bechutz l'smani pasal bein bekaretz. So then he had a bad thought, a pigel thought. So then the mincha is pasal, but there's no kares, because when did you have the bad thought? When it was in the left hand, when the left hand was in a situation where you could not do the service anyway. So then it's not a pigel thought. It's not a pickle that gives a chorus thought. So if they end up baking these the shirayim into matzah, you wouldn't get chorus. But let's say they put it in your right hand, you put it back into your right hand, and now it's in your right hand. You had a pickle thought. So if it's a chusl mekayim thought, then possible chorus. Chutzl zmani pickle v'chiyav chorus. But if you have a chutzl zmani thought, since it's in your right hand, it is a good thought. So Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon holds the fact that you interrupted taking the kamitza, putting in your left hand, did not alter the kashrus of the mincha. You could just simply put it back into your right hand. Rav Shimon says, Chacham says, as soon as you took the kamitza and you put it in your left hand, then you're disqualified. My time, what's the reason? Mishum teboya kedusha bekeli, because you have to do a kedusha in keli. Since you are supposed to put it into right away klisharis, but if you went and took the kamitza and put it into your left hand, so once you put it into your left hand, so then it's as if an interruption happened from the time that you did the kamitza to the time that it's supposed to be caught in the vessel. Like when you shechta an animal, as soon as the blood comes out of the animal, you have to catch it in a vessel. And so this would be similar if you did the kamitza and put it in your left hand, it's similar to a person shechted an animal. And then what happened? The blood fell on the floor and you're lifting the blood from the floor back into the vessel. So this blood is disqualified, as you can see in the picture, disqualified from using for zrika. And that's the same. So now, let's get back to our question against Rab Shimon. Michlal, let us see. Rab Shimon loy by a matan klei. Rab Shimon don't need a matan klei because the fact that you could interrupt it with putting it in your left hand, that's fine. And Rav Nachman said that even Rab Shimon would require that as soon as you do the kamitza, you have to put it in klisharis. And here the Brisa says if you put it in your left hand following the kamitza, that's fine, according to Rab Shimon. Tiyufta the Rav Nachman, this will be a refutation against Rav Nachman. Answers Gemara, Tiyufta. Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Chia Messiah lay. According to Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Chia, this is a good proof that Rab Shimon does not require a keli. He says that after you do the kamitza, you could use your hand, but use your right hand. Rabbi Yanai, let me tell you too. What did Rabbi Yanai say? Rabbi Yanai says once you do the kli shares, you don't. That's it. Once you do the kamitza, you can put the kamitza wherever you want. And here the Brisa says it still needs to be in your right hand. Rabbi Yanai says, "Anodamik tonight the hekta v'lavlitz dodim katani." I have a brisa already that agrees with me that once you did the kamitza, Rab Shimon says you could put it in, you could use any which hand you want, and that's fine. So Rabbi Yanai has a brisa that supports him. So basically, the Gemara just shlugged up Rab Nachman Bar Yitzchak's understanding of Rab Shimon, but the Rabbi Yehuda is the first understanding of Rab Shimon. Is Rab Shimon says that if you do the kamitza, you can take your right hand and just throw it onto the mizbeach. But if you put it into a kli shares, then you don't have to use your right hand. You can use either hand. You could use either hand when putting it on the mizbeach. Then the Brisa says, "Hikta kumtza pamayim." If you did it twice, if you makter the kamitza twice. So if you did the kamitza twice, it means you broke it up into small different pieces and then put a drop on the mizbeach. The Mishnah says it's kosher. So the Mishnah says you broke it into two parts. Amar Rab Shubam Levi. Pamayim, the only time the kamitza is kosher if you break it into two parts. Like pamayim. But not, you can't break it into 4 parts or 6 parts. You can break the kamitza into many different parts. It doesn't matter. You could break it into little balls, and then that's kamitza would be fine, as you can see. My benai, what's the source of the machlokes? Or Rabbi Zera, yesh kamis pachas from nezeisim, yesh aktar b'chusim b'kazayis ika benaya. There is a story regarding. So the Gemara explains what is the machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shmuel Levi. Rabbi Zera explained, yesh kamis pachas mishnei kazeisim, yesh aktar b'chusim b'kazayis ika benaya. Does the kamitza have to be a minimum of 2 zaysim? So then you can break it up in half and put a zayas on the mizbeach in two parts. So a kohen at least has to have a hand that could hold two zaysim, and the haktara cannot be less than a kazayas. So Rabbi Shubin Levi Sabara ein komitz pachas mishnei zaysim. You can't use a tiny kohen with small hands. He has to have a kamitza that could hold two zaysim, and ein haktara pachos kazayas. And haktara on the mizbeach can't be less than a kazayas. Therefore, he holds. Rabbi Shubin Levi holds. And when Mishnah says you could, if the kamitza was broken up into two parts, it means exactly two parts. And each part being a kazayas. It doesn't matter how big the coin is. You could have a tiny coin doing the kmitza. So the kmitza itself doesn't have two zaysim. So it doesn't matter even if you break it up into because even by definition, if it's less than two zaysim, when you break it up into two parts, each part is going to be less than a zayis anyway. So therefore, according to Rabbi Yochanan, the understanding of the Mishnah is it's not precisely two parts and that's it. You can break it up into 4-5 different parts into balls and makdur it on the mizbeach. That would be fine according to Rabbi Yochanan's understanding of the Mishnah. Now the Gemara, final part of the daf, itmer, we learned koimitz meimesay mati shirayim bechila. Once the koimitz is burnt on the mizbeach, then the leftovers, as you can see in the picture, what did they do with the leftovers after they brought the kamitza? They baked it into chilash like matzahs, and they ate the shirayim. So the Gemara says, how much of the koimitz has to be burnt, then that you can start eating the shirayim. As soon as the fire singed it a little bit, the kamitza, then you could eat the rest. Rabbi Yochanan says it's almost like burning chametz. When the fire burnt most of the kamitz, only then you could eat the leftovers. Obviously, it's only the kahanim eating the leftovers. Let me explain to you why Rabbi Yochanan says that means that the most of the koimitz have to be burned. Because the pasuk says by Sodom, all kitar arts kitar kivsha. So kitar is the smoke of a furnace. When Torah tells you haktorah, it's like a furnace smoked. A kivshan mala kitar achatasas oberubai. A furnace will not blow smoke until most of the wood is on fire. So if you have a furnace, you put wood in it, once most of the wood is burnt, then the furnace will start giving off smoke. Same thing over here. That you need to have most of the stuff. So, they said to Ravin, that your student Rav Amram said the following. Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, the Brisa is saying that I only know that the limbs of the animal, the fats, you could bring it after sunset, put it on the mizbeach. You shechted the carbon during the day, and there was crowds, and you couldn't get to the mizbeach. The kahanim would bring it up at night. But let's say it's something that's supposed to be done during the daytime. How do I know that you could bring it up at night? So the Gemara says, well, like the koimitz has to be done on the daytime, and ketores has to be done during the daytime. How do you know you could do it at night also? So the Gemara says, well, I'm a darkly karbayan, but didn't you just tell me that it has to be only be brought during the daytime? Ella, the Bryce is telling you, im boyashemesh. How do you know 2 seconds before sunset that you could bring the kamitza? That's what the Bryce is saying. Hakoimitz, how do you know I can bring the kamitza onto the mizbeach 2 seconds before sunset? And then you can leave it there. Menayin Talmud Loima Zoyis Taras Oila Reba. The Brisa says Reba. Anything that's supposed to be brought on the mizbeach, once you bring a little bit on the mizbeach, that's fine. Says the Gemara. So you see from this Brisa is that you don't have to bring it onto the mizbeach a half hour before sunset. 2 seconds before sunset, you can put the kamitza on the mizbeach. So what you see from here is that you don't need the fire to singe the whole thing in order to be matzah the shrayim. Answers the Gemara like kasha, it's not difficult. Kan likloi kan lahater. Yes, to bring it on the mizbeach, you could bring it 1 second before sunset. But if you want to matter the shirayim for achila, if you want to matter the shirayim la'achila, then you have to wait till the whole thing singes, till the most of it burnt. Rabbi Loza had a different understanding of this brisa. It's not talking about the initial putting on the mizbeach. You put it on the mizbeach, let's say a half hour before sunset. What the brisa is talking about, how do you know that if something pops off the mizbeach, you could put it on the mizbeach after sunset? That it's talking about that it popped off the mizbeach, and once it popped off the mizbeach, the Bryce is teaching you that if you put it on the mizbeach way before sunset, and then after sunset, during the dark time, you see that they popped off the mizbeach, you could put it on back on the mizbeach. So says the Gemara, did Rabbi Yani say that all these things, the kaimits, levonik, ketaris that fall off the mizbeach, you could put it on back on the mizbeach. The ketaris that popped off the mizbeach, afilu krotim shabab, even if chips of the ketaris fell off the mizbeach hapnimi, you don't put it back on the mizbeach. The Taner Rabchia Bar Menyum Debei Rabbi Loza Ben Yaakov Asher Toichal Oasis Oila Mizbeach Ikuli Oila Aftamachzer. The Torah says that that anything that's supposed to be burnt on the mizbeach via as a carbon oila, if it pops off the mizbeach, you return it. But you ketaris that pops off the mizbeach apnimi, you don't put it back on. So how could Rabbi Yanai say that this Bryce is discussing stuff that popped off the mizbeach? Bryce says ketaris, and Rabbi Yanai's understanding of the Bryce is that ketaris, if it pops off the anything that pops off the mizbeach, that in this list you put it back on the mizbeach. And says the Gemara, right? Sumi mekan ketaris. You'll have to erase the word ketaris from this Bryce, and the Bryce is talking about other things, the kamitza and levoina, minchas kahana and minchas kain mashiach, all these things that minchas nesachem that you put it on the mizbeach prior to sunset. If they popped off the mizbeach, you could return it. Everything except the ketaris. But again, the machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon Chananya Chanina remain. And if when there's the kaimetz mated the shraim the chila, Chanina says as soon as a little bit of the kaimetz starts to burn, Rabbi Yochanan says you need most of the kaimetz to be burnt. Amar Rabbi Asi ki pasha Rabbi Loza ben Menachos. Rabbi Loza was teaching us Masechta Menachos. He asked the following question: kaimetz shesidri v'sidri alav as amaracha. A kaimetz that you put on the fire, and here's the mizbeach, right? You have the mizbeach. And he put it like not on top of the fire, but he put it like on the fire underneath, and then put wood on top of it. That was the question: is that called haktara? The Torah tells you put it on the fire, but maybe and not put wood on top of it. That was the question. Kaimitz you put on the fire, and then you put wood on top of it. Maho, what's the din? Derech haktar bakach, is that called burning the ketiris? Or ein derech haktar bakach, or is that not called burning the ketiris? Teku, that remains questionable. Boy Chizki has the simic question regarding a carbon. Aver and Shesidim Sidra Lemas Racha, you put the limbs of a carbon on the mizbeach, and then you put wood on top of it. Maho, alo eitz mamar. The Torah says that the limbs are supposed to be put on the wood. Dafka ala eitzim, you have to put the limbs on the wood. Dilma kima the ksiv krachina asher toichal ho'eish, the fire consumes esa oila, the carbon oila al hamizbeach, that's on the mizbeach, and so it's mashma that you could put the limbs on the mizbeach and then put wood on top of it and burn it. So you could do it any which way you want. Teku, the Gemara says this remains unresolved. Rabbi Yitzchak had a question. If you put it on the side of the mizbeach, you put the Avrim, right next to, like where it says Yud Beis over here, you put the Avrim over there, and somehow it got burnt. So it's on the mizbeach, not on top of the wood. So what's the din with that? If according to the person that says it has to be al ho'etzim on the wood, so then there's no question. That's not on the wood. It's on the mizbeach. The al ho'etzim, because the Torah tells you put it on the wood. According to our understanding, that al doesn't mean on top; it could be next to the wood. So next to the wood can mean underneath the wood. But what about on the side of the wood? Hochiname al basamech oidilma al eitzim dumi dalam mizbeach. Ma hasam al mamish af hochiname al mamish. So it has to be on. Maybe it means on. Really has to be on the wood or on the mizbeach, but not next to. So it has to be somehow touching it. Teku, the Gemara remains this question unresolved. So we ended as a Hashem. Menachos Daf Chav Vav.